Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, today we're digging into a pretty significant stack of sources you, our listener, flagged for us. They detail what looks like an immediate and frankly pretty brutal collapse of the U.S.-China trade détente. We're talking October 10th, 2025.
Yeah, that date really jumps out. This isn't just a rerun of, 2018 or the earlier tariff skirmishes.
No, the sources frame this very differently. They're calling it Trade War 2.0. And it seems supercharged this time, right? It's all about AI, quantum computing, and suddenly this very aggressive use of rare earth geopolitics.
Exactly. It's a whole new ballgame. So our mission today really is to cut through the noise for you. We need to unpack the structural meaning of this rupture, what it signals long-term.
Okay, so what's the plan? How are we tackling this?
We're focusing on three core areas. First, the immediate shockwaves. What happened in the markets, the real tangible damage on day one.
Got it. The immediate fallout.
Second, the weapons themselves. This is key. The sources really emphasize the difference now. It's about controlling atoms versus algorithms. Physical materials versus digital power.
Atoms versus algorithms. I like that framing. And a third area.
That's the legal wildcard, specifically how the Supreme Court, based on recent rulings, might either accelerate this whole decoupling thing or potentially throw a wrench in the works over the next year or so.
Okay, sounds like a solid plan. Let's dive in. Right, so let's start with that timeline, because this didn't just happen overnight on October 10th, did it? It feels like a culmination.
Absolutely not. You've got those underlying issues that have been simmering for, well, decades, really. The sources remind us huge trade imbalances, constant accusations flying back and forth about IP theft, forced tech transfers.
Yeah, the usual suspects. Control over semiconductors, rare earths. Those strategic resources have always been there in the background.
They're the foundational cracks, exactly. But what's really different now, according to these analyses, is the sheer intensity and the speed of escalation under the current U.S. administration's America First banner.
There's a real focus on decoupling, on economic self-reliance this time around. It feels less negotiable.
Completely. That's why 2025 feels so different from 2018. The commitment to decoupling seems much firmer, much more explicit. And the pace, well, it's been breakneck.
So walk us through that escalation in 2025. It kicked off pretty early in the year, didn't it, with the tariff blitz, as the sources call it.
That's right. Early 2025, that's where the first real shots were fired in this round. The U.S. didn't just reimpose tariffs, they massively expanded them. They hit sectors that maybe got a lighter touch before.
And the numbers were pretty eye-watering.
Astonishingly high. We're talking rates up to 145% on certain Chinese goods. Think electric vehicles, specific types of steel, solar panel components.
Wow, 145%. What was the justification given?
The administration argued it was about protecting those new domestic supply chains they're trying to build with the IRA and SHUPS Act funding, shielding them from, what they called subsidized foreign competition.
And China's response? Predictable, I guess?
Symmetrical and immediate. They hit back hard, with tariffs reaching up to 125% on key U.S. exports. They targeted things that would hurt soybeans, components for civilian aircraft, American luxury cars. Real pain points.
And that initial volley, that tariff blitz, it had a real-world effect straight away, particularly for certain parts of the U.S. economy.
Oh, absolutely. Especially the American heartland. This is where you start seeing the strategic element really bite. U.S. agricultural exports just plummeted.
Soybeans especially, right? That's a classic target.
Classic target. But here's the shift. China didn't just sit there and take the price hike. They used this as an opportunity to accelerate their diversification strategy.
Moving away from reliance on the U.S.
Exactly. The data shows Beijing moved fast to lock in stronger, longer-term deals with Brazil and Russia for grains and soybeans. And they significantly boosted commodity trade with various African nations, too.
So it wasn't just a temporary market reaction. It looks like a permanent structural shift, weakening that traditional U.S. leverage food exports.
That's the concern highlighted in the sources, yes. It potentially weakens that leverage point permanently.
Okay, so we had the blitz. Things got really tense. But then there was a moment mid-year where things seemed to cool off, a temporary ceasefire.
Right. In June, there was this brief sigh of relief in global markets. Negotiators managed to hammer out a 90-day tariff freeze.
Just a pause button, essentially.
Pretty much. The idea was a cooling off period. U.S. tariffs dropped back to around 30%. China's down to 10%. Much more manageable levels.
And there was talk of a summit, Xi and Trump.
Hopes were definitely high for a potential summit to maybe broker some kind of bigger lasting deal. But, and this is crucial, the sources are very clear, the fundamental disagreements didn't go away.
They just weren't discussed.
Exactly. Control over rare earth access, the restrictions on cutting-edge AI tech, those core strategic sticking points, they were just left on the table, completely unresolved. It felt, in retrospect, like an unofficial pause, just buying time.
And that time ran out spectacularly between September and October. It seems like technology controls, not just tariffs, were the real trigger this time.
That's spot on. The breakdown wasn't about soybeans this time. It was ignited when the U.S. rolled out new, very specific chip restrictions.
Aimed squarely at Chinese AI development.
Directly at Chinese AI firms. The goal was clearly to limit their ability to train the next generation of large language models, the really powerful AI.
And China's reaction was?
Immediate and furious. Beijing publicly accused Washington of economic bullying. And then they pulled out their biggest non-tariff weapon.
The rare earths announcement. This sounds like a major escalation. Tell us about that 0.1% rule.
Okay, this is critical. Beijing announced that starting December 1st, any product at all containing more than 0.1% Chinese rare earth materials by weight would need specific government approval before it could be exported.
Wait, 0.1%? That's tiny. That captures almost everything complex, doesn't it?
Precisely. It's an incredibly strategic, almost surgical move. It's not a blunt tariff. It's a regulatory chokehold. They don't need to ban rare earth exports outright.
They just need the power to say no.
Exactly. By setting this incredibly low threshold, they effectively gain a veto power over the export of almost any sophisticated global product. Think components for smartphones, medical devices, advanced sensors, even parts for an F-35 fighter jet's radar system. If it has even a trace amount of Chinese-processed critical minerals, Beijing now potentially has the legal hook to block its export.
That gives them instantaneous, massive leverage over, well, pretty much every advanced manufacturing sector globally.
That's the assessment. Unprecedented leverage.
And the immediate follow-on, the tit-for-tat right after that announcement, that's what cemented the breakdown on October 10th itself.
The dominoes fell fast. The U.S. Commerce Department responded almost instantly. They added 14 key Chinese companies to the entity list.
The entity list, that means U.S. firms can't sell to them, right?
Correct. It cuts them off from essential U.S. technology software components. And these weren't random companies. They were firms deep in advanced AI hardware, quantum computing research, satellite tech, very strategic targets.
And China fired back.
They mirrored the strategy, expanding their own unreliable entity list. They added 16 high-profile U.S. companies. Many of them were major defense contractors or big tech exporters.
So mirroring the sanctions, but they added something else too, did they? A logistical weapon.
Yes, but the final spark, the one that really lit the fuse in the markets on the 10th, actually came from the U.S. side first. President Trump announced via social media plans for a massive increase in tariffs. And importantly, he dismissed any need for a diplomatic meeting. Just shut the door.
Okay, so that was the final straw.
That seemed to be it. Within hours, China retaliated with that new logistical weapon you mentioned. They imposed these sweeping new retaliatory port fees.
Port fees? How does that work?
Basically, a hefty charge slapped on all U.S.-owned, U.S.-operated, or U.S.-flagged vessels entering or leaving Chinese ports. And it was effective almost immediately October 14th, a direct hit on shipping.
Okay, so the truce is definitively over. Diplomacy is off the table, new sanctions, new fees. What was the market's gut reaction to all this on October 10th?
It was severe, utterly visceral. Global equity markets just hemorrhaged value. The sources estimate a collective loss of around $1.65 trillion in market capitalization.
$1.65 trillion in one day.
In a single trading day. It was a direct monetary vote of no confidence, a pricing in of a sustained structural conflict, not just a temporary spat.
Which markets got hit hardest?
The Dow Jones fell sharply, over 800 points, about 1.14%. But the NASDAQ, the tech-heavy index, got hammered even worse. It tumbled 2.3%.
And that makes sense, given the focus on tech controls.
Exactly. The sell-off was clearly led by companies right in the crosshairs of this new tech battlefront. Semiconductor manufacturers, EV producers, any firm relying on those complex, now vulnerable global supply chains.
So with all that uncertainty flooding the system, where did the money go? Where did investors run for cover?
We saw that classic flight to safety, but maybe with a bit of a 2025 twist. Oil prices dropped sharply, down 4.3%.
Signaling fears of an economic slowdown.
Big fears of a global industrial slowdown that would hit energy demand hard. At the same time, capital flooded into the usual safe havens U.S. Treasuries got a bid, their prices rose.
Okay, standard playbook so far.
But interestingly, the sources also note significant inflows into non-sovereign digital assets. Specifically, Bitcoin saw a noticeable surge.
So investors looking for something outside the traditional system, potentially uncorrelated with this geopolitical mess.
That seems to be the interpretation. Seeking assets potentially insulated from nation-state conflicts or fiat currency risks, the overall message from the market was loud and clear. This isn't a blip. This is a structural fracture, and investors are scrambling for shelter, wary of global growth forecasts.
Okay, that market reaction really sets the stage, and it highlights what makes this trade war 2.0 feel fundamentally different.
Yeah.
You framed it as atoms versus algorithms. It's a fight for the essential inputs of the next industrial age, right?
Precisely. It's moved beyond just tariffs on finished goods. Now it's about controlling the foundational elements.
So let's start with the atom side of that equation, rare earth elements. You call this China's strategic nuclear option. Why is their position so dominant?
Well, it's their primary asymmetric leverage point.
Yeah.
And it's multi-layered. It's not just that they mine a lot of the raw material, although they do over 70% of the world's rare earth ore.
70% is a huge market share.
It is, but the real dominance, the chokehold, comes further down the supply chain. China controls nearly 90% of the crucial processing and magnet manufacturing stages. That's where the value is added, and that's where the bottlenecks lie.
Okay, let's unpack that. These 17 elements, the lanthanides plus scandium and yttrium, why are they so indispensable?
They have unique magnetic and conductive properties that are just incredibly difficult, often impossible to replicate with other materials. Essential for high-strength permanent magnets, advanced battery chemistries, catalysts, specialized optics, the list goes on.
And you emphasize the processing and separation stage as the real choke point. Why is that specific step so hard to replicate quickly outside of China? Let's get into the weeds a bit here.
Right. This is key to understanding the leverage. Think of the supply chain in 4 main stages: mining the ore, then processing and separation, then refining and metallurgy into usable metals, and finally end-use manufacturing, like making magnets or batteries.
Okay, 4 stages.
Mining deposits exist elsewhere. The U.S. has Mountain Pass, Australia has Linus, Brazil has resources, so mining isn't the absolute bottleneck. But stage 2, processing and separation, turning that mixed ore, which contains multiple rare earth elements all jumbled together, into individual high-purity oxides. That's the incredibly difficult part.
Why technically difficult?
It involves hundreds of complex, continuous chemical processes, mostly solvent extraction and ion exchange, running 247 in huge, specialized chemical plants. Imagine vast networks of tanks, pipes, and control systems.
That's expensive.
Hugely expensive. It requires massive amounts of specialized chemical reagents, consumes a lot of energy, and this is a big factor. It generates enormous quantities of hazardous waste, often including radioactive byproducts like thorium.
The environmental angle. So years ago, Western countries basically decided this was too dirty, too complex, too expensive, and effectively offshored it.
That's exactly what happened. China was willing to absorb the environmental costs, invest heavily in the complex chemical engineering know-how, and build out that massive midstream processing capacity over decades.
And now they have this infrastructural dominance.
You do. So when you ask why it's hard to replicate, well, think about trying to build a brand new multi-billion-dollar environmentally sensitive chemical processing facility from scratch today in the West. You need specialized labor, you face years of permitting hurdles, massive capital investment, and it's not something you can just swish on overnight. That's the choke point.
That makes the 5-10-year timeline for alternatives seem more realistic, maybe even optimistic.
It's a huge challenge, yes.
Let's connect this back to specific high-tech and defense uses. Are there particular rare earth elements that are more critical than others right now?
Definitely. The ones getting the most attention are the heavy REEs, particularly dysprosium, symbol di, and terbium, TB.
Why those two specifically?
Because they're essential for high-temperature performance in magnets. They help neodymium iron boron, ND-Fe magnets, the strongest type of permanent magnets known, retain their magnetism even when things get hot.
Which is critical for?
Critical for things like electric vehicle traction motors, which operate under heavy load. Also vital for precision-guided missiles, wind turbine generators, and crucially, for the sophisticated ASA radar systems used in modern fighter jets like the F-35. These radars are the eyes and ears of advanced aircraft.
So that 0.1% rule China imposed, it seems tailor-made to put a squeeze on global defense and high-tech electronics industries.
It appears designed precisely for that, to make those industries acutely aware of their dependency on Chinese export approvals for even trace amounts of these critical heavy REs.
Okay, so even with the world scrambling to diversify funding projects like Linus in Australia, Mountain Pass in the US, the timeline remains the big vulnerability.
The timeline is the crux of the problem. Building that full mine-to-magnet capability outside China, especially mastering that difficult midstream processing and separation at scale, the consensus estimate is 5 to 10 years, minimum. Until then, the global industrial base remains highly exposed to Chinese policy decisions on these elements.
Okay, that covers the atoms. Now let's flip to the other side. America's counter-leverage, the algorithms. If China controls the physical inputs, the U.S. seems focused on the digital ones.
That's the strategy, yes. The U.S. weapon of choice here is primarily financial and technological control, specifically choking off China's access to the bleeding-edge computational power needed for the AI arms race.
How are they doing that?
Primarily through export bans on the most advanced semiconductors. We're talking about the top-tier AI accelerators chips like NVIDIA's H100 or AMD's MI300X series.
These aren't just standard chips, right? They're specialized.
Highly specialized. They're designed specifically for the massive parallel processing required to train today's enormous large language models and run complex simulations, like those needed for defense applications or scientific research. They are, in effect, the engines of modern AI supremacy.
And this isn't just a unilateral U.S. move. It relies heavily on getting allies on board, particularly regarding the manufacturing of these chips.
Absolutely critical. The U.S. strategy leans heavily on cooperation with key allies, sometimes referred to as the Chip Four or similar groupings. Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea are central here,
Why those specific countries?
because they control crucial choke points in the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain. The Netherlands, through ASML, has a monopoly on the most advanced EUV extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, which are essential for etching the tiniest, most powerful transistors onto silicon wafers. Japan is dominant in specialized chemicals and manufacturing equipment. South Korea is a leader in memory chips and advanced packaging.
So the U.S. is coordinating with them to restrict China's access not just to the finished chips, but to the tools needed to make advanced chips domestically.
Precisely. It's a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Control the chip designs, mostly U.S. Control the electronic design automation, EDA software, mostly U.S. Control the finished high-end chips, U.S. designs. A&D control the critical manufacturing equipment needed to catch up, allied cooperation.
So you end up with this clear technological stalemate, as the sources describe it.
It's a stark division. The U.S. and its allies control the high-end algorithms, the chip designs, the core software, the global financial system underpinning it all. China controls the indispensable atoms, the rare earths, other critical minerals, and the massive manufacturing scale for many physical goods.
And both sides are essentially trying to strangle the other's innovation pipeline at these fundamental choke points.
That's the dynamic. It's a deep strategic contest over the foundational elements of future economic and military power.
Okay, let's bring in the third front you mentioned, the logistics war. These tit-for-tat port fees sound almost mundane compared to rare earths and AI chips, but you suggested their impact could be huge, especially on inflation.
They might sound administrative, but don't underestimate them. This is using friction, bureaucracy, and cost as a direct economic weapon.
How significant is shipping in the U.S.-China trade picture?
It's dominant. Roughly 60% of all bilateral trade between the U.S. and China moves by sea freight. So targeting shipping hits a massive volume of goods.
And these new fees China imposed, how much are we talking?
The analysts cited in the source's estimate they could range anywhere from $50,000 to potentially $200,000 per vessel, depending on the ship's size, its cargo, and its ownership or flag registry. That's a significant immediate cost added to every single voyage affected.
What do shipping companies do? Just pay it.
They have a few options, none of them good.
Well,
They can absorb the cost, which hurts their already tight margins. They can immediately pass the cost on to their clients, the importers and exporters, which fuels inflation. Or they can try to reroute.
rerouting sounds complicated. How would that even work for U.S.-China trade?
It usually involves transshipment. So a vessel carrying U.S.-bound goods from China might now sail to an intermediate neutral port, think Singapore, maybe Busan in South Korea, perhaps even a port in Mexico.
And then what?
There, the containers are offloaded from the U.S.-flagged or operated ship and reloaded onto a ship with a different flag or operator, one not subject to the fees, for the final leg of the journey to the U.S., or vice versa for U.S. exports to China.
That sounds like it adds a lot of time and cost.
Immense complexity. You've got additional port handling fees at the intermediate stop, potential warehousing costs, scheduling nightmares, and most importantly, it adds significant transit time, potentially weeks, to the journey.
Which kills just-in-time supply chain.
Exactly. Think fresh produce, fast fashion, critical medical supplies, anything time-sensitive gets severely disrupted. Plus, the added complexity increases the risk of delays, damage, or loss.
And the bottom line impact of all this friction, the fees, the rerouting, the delays, eventually hits consumers.
Absolutely, and relatively quickly. The analysts looking at this estimate that these accumulating logistics costs the direct fees, the transshipment surcharges, the longer transit times, the higher insurance premiums that inevitably follow, could easily add 2% to 3% to overall consumer inflation in the U.S.
2 to 3% just from these shipping issues.
That's the projection. Within about 6 months, this pressure would be felt broadly across almost all imported manufactured goods. It acts as a kind of structural inflationary force, separate from what the Fed is doing with interest rates. It just makes everything coming across the Pacific more expensive. #3, economic costs, strategic decoupling, and future scenarios.
Okay, we've laid out the weapons, the atoms, algorithms, logistics. Now let's quantify the damage. If this conflict continues and those peak tariffs snap back the 145% from the U.S., 125% from China, what's the big picture macroeconomic hit?
Well, the economic models discussed in these sources paint a pretty bleak picture. It really underscores that this is a lose-lose scenario, certainly for global growth.
What kind of numbers are we talking?
If those high tariff levels were maintained for a full year, economists estimate the potential drag on GDP could be around 1.8% for the United States.
1.8%, that's a serious headwind.
It is, and for China, the estimated hit is even steeper, potentially 2.5% of their GDP.
Wow. So both sides take a significant hit. What about the global impact?
This scale of decoupling between the world's two largest economies doesn't happen in a vacuum. The projections suggest it could erase something like $400 billion in total world output. And that pain isn't shared equally. It tends to disproportionately harm smaller, emerging economies that rely heavily on trade flows between the U.S. and China.
Okay, GDP percentages can feel a bit abstract. How does this translate down to the level of an average American household budget?
This is where it becomes very tangible for people. These tariffs, especially on consumer goods, act like an indirect tax, and it tends to be regressive.
Meaning it hits lower-income households harder?
Generally, yes, as a larger portion of their budget goes towards goods affected by import costs. The estimates suggest the average American household could see their annual expenses rise by somewhere between $1,200 and $1,400.
An extra $1,200 to $1,400 a year. Where would that show up most?
You'd see significant price hikes, potentially 10% to 30% increases on a wide range of everyday imported products. Think consumer electronics, laptops, smartphones, TVs, also apparel, footwear, furniture, household appliances, basically a lot of the stuff people buy regularly.
So just as inflation was maybe starting to cool, this injects a whole new persistent pressure.
Exactly. It creates this deep structural inflationary pressure that's driven purely by geopolitics and trade friction, making it much harder to get back to, say, a 2% inflation target.
And we touched on agriculture earlier, but the sources really emphasize the ongoing pain there. U.S. soybean exports to China down 60% already.
That figure is stark. 60% decline since the initial tariff hikes. You have to remember, China was, for a long time, an absolutely critical market for U.S. farmers, particularly soybean growers. We're talking about a market once worth around $14 billion annually.
And that market isn't just shrinking, it's being actively replaced.
That's the key point from the analysis. China's pivot to suppliers like Brazil and Russia isn't just opportunistic, it appears strategic and long-term. They're diversifying away from dependence on the U.S.
Which means U.S. farmers can't just wait for things to blow over.
It seems unlikely. This shift is causing real distress. The sources note that Midwest farm bankruptcies, which had started to level off, are now ticking back up again. Farmers are facing a really difficult multi-year adjustment, needing to find new markets or shift production, and those alternatives don't just appear overnight at the scale needed.
Okay, so major disruptions, clear losers. But in any big shakeup like this, there are usually winners too. Who benefits strategically from this accelerated decoupling?
Well, the primary beneficiaries tend to be those positioned to capitalize on the big push for supply chain diversification, what's often called the China Plus One strategy.
Meaning companies keep some presence in China for the local market, but build redundant capacity elsewhere.
Exactly. Build resilience outside of China. Domestically within the U.S., the sources point to U.S. manufacturing as a significant winner,
Boosted by government policy.
massively boosted by the subsidies and incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and the CHIPS Act. There's a strong tailwind favoring Made in America components now, especially in target sectors like EVs, batteries, and advanced semiconductors.
Any other sectors benefiting domestically?
Defense and cybersecurity firms are also highlighted. Increased geopolitical tension and the focus on technological rivalry naturally drives up demand and valuations in those sectors.
And looking beyond the U.S., which countries are picking up the manufacturing activity that's shifting out of China?
The sources consistently point to three major beneficiaries: Mexico, Vietnam, and India.
Vietnam seems to be a big one.
Huge. Its exports to the U.S. are reportedly up something like 34% year on year. It's become a really crucial hub, especially for assembling low to mid-tier electronics, apparel, footwear, the kinds of manufacturing that might have previously been concentrated in China.
And Mexico. Leveraging geography.
Leveraging its proximity to the U.S. market, classic nearshoring, Mexico is attracting more complex manufacturing, particularly in the automotive sector and industrial goods, aiming to serve the U.S. tariff-free under USMCA.
India's role.
India is rapidly scaling up its capacity, especially in high-tech assembly. The most cited example is Apple significantly increasing iPhone production there. It's becoming a serious alternative for complex electronics manufacturing.
Okay, so clear winners in diversification. Now, conversely, who are the biggest losers beyond the U.S. farmers we already discussed?
The primary losers are, perhaps obviously, the American companies most deeply intertwined with either Chinese manufacturing operations or the vast Chinese consumer market.
Big tech comes to mind.
Absolutely. U.S. tech and AI giants are facing major headwinds. Think Apple, with its huge manufacturing footprint and consumer market in China. Think NVIDIA, facing restrictions on selling its most advanced AI chips to China. Think Tesla, with its Shanghai Gigafactory and significant sales there. All face increased risks, supply chain friction, and potential market access issues.
And other sectors.
Shipping and major retailers are also clearly feeling the pain. Companies like Maersk or Hapag-Lloyd on the shipping side and big box retailers like Walmart and Target on the retail side, they bear the immediate brunt of the logistics war, the higher costs, the inventory challenges. It squeezes their margins and complicates their operations significantly.
It sounds like multinational corporations aren't just waiting to see how this plays out politically. They're actively trying to manage the risk now, especially around critical inputs like rare earths. What's this friendshoring playbook the sources describe? It seems quite structured.
It is. It's a conscious, multi-track effort by allied nations and corporations to systematically reduce their vulnerability to that Chinese dominance, particularly in critical minerals. It's a fundamental shift from prioritizing pure cost efficiency to prioritizing resilience and security.
Okay, let's break down the three tracks they mentioned. What's track one?
Track one is build non-Chinese midstream capacity. This directly targets that processing and separation bottleneck we discussed earlier.
Trying to replicate that complex chemical stage outside China.
Exactly. It requires massive, coordinated investment, both government funding and private capital, to actually build these complex chemical plants elsewhere. We're seeing major expansions being financed at places like the Mountain Pass facility in California and new processing plants backed by countries like Japan being built in Australia by Lennes, for example. The specific goal is to create capacity for that difficult multi-stage chemical separation of rare earth oxides into usable metals and alloys, completely bypassing the need for Chinese facilities.
Okay, build alternative processing. What's track two?
Track two is engineer around the problematic elements. This focuses specifically on reducing the dependency on those heavy rare earths like dysprosium, D, di, and terbium, TB, which are particularly concentrated in Chinese supply chains.
How do you engineer around them if they're essential for performance?
Two main approaches here: material substitution where possible, though often performance suffers, and more promisingly, process innovation in how the elements are used. Companies are investing heavily in R&D to significantly reduce the amount of D-di and TB needed in high-performance NdFeB magnets.
Using less of the critical stuff, but keeping the magnets strong.
Right. For instance, instead of mixing the dysprosium uniformly throughout the magnet material, they're developing advanced techniques like grain boundary diffusion. Think of it like, instead of baking the expensive spice into the entire cake batter, you cleverly coat just the outside of the critical crystal structures within the magnet. This can maintain high temperature performance while using vastly less of the scarce, supply chain vulnerable, heavy rare earth element.
Clever. Okay, track 1 builds capacity. Track 2 reduces demand for critical elements. What's track 3?
Track 3 is scale up recycling and embrace the circular economy. This is about creating supply from waste, sometimes called urban mining.
How much rare earth recycling happens now?
Currently, it's tiny. Global recycling accounts for less than 5% of the total rare earth supply needed each year. Most used magnets from old hard drives, electronics, EV motors, wind turbines just end up in landfills.
A huge waste of valuable material.
A massive waste. So the goal now, backed by significant government and corporate funding, is to dramatically increase that recycling rate, aiming for 20% to 30% of supply coming from recycled sources by the mid-2030s.
How do you make that happen? It sounds difficult.
It involves developing better collection systems for end-of-life products and, crucially, investing in new, more efficient recycling technologies. Traditional methods can be energy-intensive and polluting. So there's a push towards innovations like bioleaching, which uses specialized microbes to selectively extract the valuable rare earth metals from shredded electronic waste or old magnets. The aim is to make recycling economically viable and scalable outside of China's established lower-cost recycling infrastructure.
So these 3 tracks together, building midstream, engineering around, scaling, recycling, represent a serious long-term effort to fundamentally reduce that strategic vulnerability.
That's the plan. It's a decade-long project at least, but the wheels are definitely in motion, accelerated by the events we're discussing.
This whole conflict, then, it really drives home the point that this isn't just about selling widgets anymore. It's about controlling the absolute bedrock of future economic and military power.
Yeah.
The sources talk about the world fracturing into 2 distinct technospheres.
Yes, that's a recurring theme in the analysis. This conflict is accelerating a divergence, pushing the world towards 2 increasingly separate spheres of technology, digital standards, and potentially even economic rule sets. They're becoming less and less interoperable.
Forcing companies and countries to choose sides, essentially.
Increasingly, yes. It forces difficult architectural choices about where you align your technology stack, your data flows, your supply chains.
How do the sources characterize these 2 emerging spheres?
On one side, you have what they term the Western cloud. This sphere is generally characterized as more decentralized, driven by private sector innovation, and dominated by the big U.S. software, cloud, and AI players. Think OpenAI, NVIDIA, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle. It tends to operate, at least nominally, under shared Western legal frameworks, emphasizes things like data privacy, though debates rage there, and relies heavily on global financial integration through systems like SWIFT.
Okay, the Western cloud and the other side.
The other side is described as the Eastern grid. This sphere is seen as much more centralized, often state-influenced or state-directed, hardware-focused, and championing national giants like Baidu, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. The emphasis here is strongly on self-reliance, achieving technological independence from the West, particularly in core areas like semiconductors. It involves massive state investment, potentially greater data centralization for national purposes, and is being consciously architected to function even if cut off from Western technological inputs or financial systems.
2 fundamentally different models competing head-to-head.
Exactly, and they're becoming increasingly distinct, potentially incompatible silos. This is a fundamental redefinition of globalization away from a single integrated system towards a multipolar, fragmented technological landscape.
So while this economic war is playing out with atoms and algorithms, there's this parallel drama unfolding in the U.S. legal system. The sources flag the Supreme Court as a major wildcard. Why is the court suddenly so central to these trade disputes?
It's become central because recent court decisions, particularly from the Supreme Court, have significantly shifted the ground rules for how much power the executive branch, the White House, actually has to impose things like these massive tariffs without very explicit, unambiguous authorization from Congress.
So the core issue is the legality of the tariffs themselves.
Precisely. There are major legal challenges arguing that the president or the trade agencies might have overstepped the authority granted to them by the specific trade laws they use to justify these tariffs. And to understand the potential outcomes, we need to grasp 2 key legal shifts that have happened recently.
Okay, what's the first big shift we need to know about?
The first is the huge Loper-Bright ruling from 2024. This case effectively overturned a decades-old legal doctrine called Chevron deference.
Chevron deference. Remind us what that was.
In simple terms, Chevron basically said that if a law passed by Congress was ambiguous or unclear on a specific point, courts should defer to how the relevant government agency, like the EPA, or in this case, maybe the Commerce Department or USTR, interpreted that ambiguity as long as the agency's interpretation was reasonable.
Giving a lot of power to the
A,
agency.
a tremendous amount of interpretive power. Now that Chevron is overturned, that deference is gone. Courts are now supposed to interpret the laws themselves using their own strict reading of the text passed by Congress.
What does that mean practically for these tariffs?
It means it's much harder for the White House or trade agencies to rely on broad or vaguely worded parts of trade laws to justify massive, sweeping actions like billions of dollars in tariffs. They now need crystal clear legal justification directly from the statute, supported by a very robust factual record. The bar for executive action on trade is significantly higher. Judges will scrutinize the legal basis much more closely.
Okay, so less deference to agencies. What's the second key legal baseline that's changed?
This relates to the specific laws being used to impose these tariffs. Recent rulings, especially from the Federal Circuit Court, which handles many trade cases, have started drawing some important distinctions.
Distinctions between which laws?
Primarily between using broad emergency powers versus using more specific trade remedy statutes. The courts have shown increasing skepticism about using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, i.e. EPA, as the basis for broad tariffs against a major trading partner like China.
IEEPA, wasn't that originally for things like sanctions against rogue states or terrorist groups?
Exactly. Its original intent was much narrower, dealing with genuine national emergencies, freezing assets of specific bad actors, using it as a kind of all-purpose tool to levy tariffs on huge categories of goods from a country you just have trade disputes with. That's seen by some judges as a legal stretch, potentially going beyond what Congress intended for IEPA.
So IEPA looks legally shaky for these kinds of tariffs. What about other laws?
Conversely, the courts have generally been more willing to uphold tariffs imposed under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974.
Section 301, that's the one specifically designed to address unfair trade practices, right? Like IP theft or forced technology transfer.
Precisely. As long as the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, followed the proper procedures, investigations, hearings, linking the tariffs directly to documented unfair Chinese practices, the courts have largely said Section 301 tariffs are within the executive branch's authority as granted by Congress.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. IEPA might be weak, Section 301 might be strong, legally speaking.
That seems to be the emerging legal landscape, yes. It means not all the tariffs currently in place rest on the same legal footing. Some might be more vulnerable to challenge than others.
Right, so let's play out the scenarios based on this. Scenario A. The Supreme Court actually strikes down some or all of these tariffs. Maybe they agree IEPA was misused, for example. What's the immediate impact?
The immediate economic effect would likely be significant. You'd probably see substantial, almost instantaneous inflation relief. If billions of dollars in tariffs are suddenly declared illegal and have to be removed, the cost of imported goods drops overnight.
Which would be good news for consumers.
Good news for consumers feeling the pinch, certainly. And in the financial markets, you'd expect a big rally in those China-exposed stocks, retailers, consumer electronics companies, auto manufacturers, anyone heavily reliant on imports from China. Their cost structure improves dramatically.
But politically, the administration's goal is still protectionist. They wouldn't just accept defeat and let imports flood back in tariff-free, would they? What's the likely White House response?
Highly unlikely they'd just give up. The sources suggest the White House would almost certainly perform a rapid procedural reroute. They wouldn't abandon the protectionist policy. They'd just try to achieve it using a different, legally sounder tool.
How would they do that?
They'd likely move quickly to reimpose the tariffs, but this time grounding them explicitly under the statutes the courts have upheld or where the president has more established authority. That probably means using Section 301 more extensively, or potentially invoking national security justifications under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which has its own legal history and controversies, but has been upheld before.
So the tariffs might come back, just under a different legal nameplate.
Exactly. It would take some time, new investigations might be needed, new paperwork filed, but the underlying protectionist intent would almost certainly persist. The trade war continues, just perhaps with a different legal justification.
And here's the critical point, right? A U.S. Supreme Court ruling about U.S. tariffs has absolutely zero impact on China's new rare earth export controls.
None whatsoever. That's the fundamental strategic reality highlighted here. A U.S. court decision might change the price of goods for American consumers and businesses by removing a tariff, but it doesn't change the availability of critical inputs controlled by Beijing. China's Bureau 0.1% rule, their potential licensing restrictions on exporting rare earths needed for AI or defense, those remain entirely in place, governed by Chinese law, not U.S. law.
So the core strategic contest over the atoms continues, regardless of what the U.S. Supreme Court says about tariffs.
That's the key takeaway. The tech and resource controls are increasingly becoming the main event, with tariffs as a secondary, albeit impactful, theater.
Okay, now let's consider scenario B. The Supreme Court upholds the tariffs. Perhaps they decide the president did have the authority under IEEPA, or they uphold the broad use of Section 301. What happens then?
If the existing tariff structures are validated by the highest court, then the economic picture looks quite different. We'd likely see inflation remaining stickier and more persistent. Those high import costs would be seen as a permanent feature of the landscape.
Making the Federal Reserve's job harder.
Much harder. It reinforces the risk of higher for longer interest rates to combat that embedded inflation. In the markets, you'd likely see a different set of winners. Domestic producers, U.S. miners, steel companies, manufacturers benefiting from IRA and CHIPS Act protection would probably gain a sustained valuation premium. They're insulated from foreign competition by tariffs that are now seen as legally durable.
And what does this legal validation mean for corporate strategy, for that decoupling trend?
It pours fuel on the fire. If the tariffs are deemed permanent and legal, it forces companies to accelerate their shift towards a definitive China or none, or maybe a China plus one as mandatory strategic framework. Hedging bets becomes less viable.
So they fully commit to building parallel systems.
Boards would likely sign off on the major long-term investments required for permanent, redundant capacity in those friendshoring locations: Mexico, Vietnam, India, maybe Eastern Europe. This isn't just about temporary workarounds anymore. It means fundamental, non-reversible architectural changes to supply chains. Think developing entirely separate bills of materials, BROMs, for products depending on the region, establishing truly independent regional manufacturing hubs. Very expensive, very complex.
And geopolitically, how might China react if the U.S. Supreme Court gives the current tariff regime a green light?
The risk of retaliation would likely rise. Beijing would probably interpret such a ruling as confirmation that the U.S. is committed to a long-term, hostile economic containment policy.
So they might double down on their own measures.
It seems probable. They might feel encouraged, even politically necessitated, to tighten those rare earth export licensing requirements even further. Maybe lengthen review times for approving exports of critical minerals, expand their own unreliable entity lists to target more U.S. companies, use regulatory hurdles more aggressively. The tit-for-tat cycle gets locked in even tighter.
Okay, so looking across both scenarios, whether the tariffs are struck down and rerouted or upheld and entrenched, what's the single most important insight about where this trade war 2.0 is truly headed?
The core insight, repeated in these analyses, is that technology controls are increasingly trumping tariffs in strategic importance.
Controls versus tariffs. Explain that distinction again.
Tariffs are essentially about price and friction. They make things more expensive, they might slow things down due to rerouting or administrative burden, they affect how much something costs or how long it takes to get somewhere. But controls like the U.S. ban on exporting advanced AI chips to China, or China's potential refusal to license rare earth exports for specific end uses, they affect possibility itself.
They determine what can or cannot be done.
Exactly. Controls dictate what can be built, what level of technological innovation can be achieved, potentially which industries can even survive in their current form. The hard limits being placed on AI compute power by the U.S. and the potential hard limits on critical mineral availability by China, those are the real levers of deep structural power in this contest. They operate independently of whatever the courts decide about the legality of tariffs. #TagV, conclusion and provocative thought.
Well, this has been an incredibly detailed and, frankly, somewhat sobering deep dive. We started with that flashpoint on October 10th, 2025, but it's clear this goes far beyond just another trade spat.
Absolutely. We've moved past the era where this was primarily about tariffs on steel or soybeans. The sources make it clear we're in a new phase, a deep structural fight for technological supremacy in the 21st century.
Defined by that collision, you described the battle over atoms, like rare earths, and algorithms, like AI chips, and the compute power they represent.
And the consequence, as we've discussed, is this accelerating fracture of the global economy. The world is visibly splitting into those two distinct economic and technological spheres.
It feels like a fundamental divorce, as you put it, between the world's two largest economies, and the ripple effects hit everyone, right? From supply chains to household budgets.
Everywhere. You have one vision, the U.S. betting on reindustrialization, fueled by protectionism and wielding technological choke points as leverage. And you have the other vision, China, betting on self-reliance, driven by centralized state control and leveraging its dominance in critical minerals and manufacturing scale.
And when these two tectonic plates collide, the economic tremors are felt globally. Persistent inflation, strategic uncertainty, companies forced to completely rethink decades of strategy.
That seems to be the new normal. The efficiency gains of peak globalization are being traded for the perceived security of resilience and redundancy. This structural shift, this globalization or fragmentation, seems baked in now.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listener. As you digest all this, the events of October 10th, the rise of atoms versus algorithms, the fracturing into two technospheres, consider this. The old dream was seamless globalization, optimizing efficiency across borders. That dream seems over. We now face a near-certain future of strategic fragmentation, where the world operates increasingly as two distinct, often non-interoperable digital and economic spheres, the Western cloud and the Eastern grid. So the unavoidable question for any global corporation, any long-term investor, is this. What is the safest and most profitable strategic architecture to adopt in this fractured world? Is ultimate safety found in choosing a side, fully regionalizing, decoupling entirely from one sphere to focus exclusively on the other? Or is the future defined by maintaining a precarious, expensive, and complex dual system where building permanent redundancy and resilience across both spheres becomes the non-negotiable cost of doing business globally?
A profound strategic dilemma with immense costs and risks, whichever path is chosen, something to seriously consider.
We'll leave you with that thought. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.